Hey guys, as we wind down tonight, we find ourselves at the edge of the Empire. A stone wall, wide enough to march a cart across, cuts through lonely hills and frostbitten forests. You stand watch with a dented helmet, a dull spear, and a stomach that's mostly hope and yesterday's beans. The wind doesn't whisper. It heckles. And you've got 6 more hours before the next shift, unless someone forgets again, which they will. There's no battle today. No heroic last stand. Just a lot of not blinking and hoping the goat doesn't freeze to the roof again. You see the wall in museums, in textbooks, on travel brochures with neat diagrams. But for the thousands of men stationed along its length, whether in China, Britain, or some half-imagined northern frontier, it wasn't history. It was home. And home, in this case, meant splinters, boredom, and trousers that never quite fit. Tonight, we'll walk a soldier's path, slowly, wearily, past sentry towers scratched with dice games, through barracks that smell like boiled wool and defeat, and into the lives of men who were promised glory and received cabbage soup instead. You might not survive this one, or worse, you might survive it and be assigned another winter rotation. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to give the video a like and hit subscribe if you're truly enjoying the journey. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always a small wonder to see people tuning in from so many corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum in the background, and together, let's ease into tonight's story. The job sounded simple. Stand still, watch the horizon, ring the bell if something tries to kill everyone. You figured, how hard could it be? You liked bells, you were vaguely familiar with horizons, and you hadn't rung anything in weeks. That should have been your first warning. You wake before the sun, not because you're diligent, but because the wind clawed its way through a crack in the barracks. It started licking your toes with the delicate grace of a mouldy dog's breath. You sit up. Your blanket, such as it is about as warm as a promise from a merchant. Thin, itchy, and covered in last week's stew stains. It smells like regret and sheep oil. Breakfast is a ladle of lukewarm grain mush that defies definition. Not porridge. Not soup. Just something that wants to be eaten, before it becomes something worse. You chew, it resists. You chew harder. It doesn't flinch. Eventually, you swallow mostly out of obligation. One of the older guards jokes that it tastes better. If you close your eyes and pretend it's yesterday, you try. It doesn't help. The tower is calling. Not literally, it doesn't have that sort of personality. But you're due on the wall, so you layer up. Tunic, cloak, second cloak, scarf that once belonged to a fellow who now serves in a warmer climate, the latrine pit. Your boots squelch unpleasantly. They always squelch. No one knows why. Once atop the wall, you survey the scene. A sea of frost, silent hills, the occasional very confident squirrel. You're supposed to be alert, vigilant, ready to sound the alarm at the first sign of danger. But the bell rope is frayed badly. Last week it snapped when the cook tried to call for more firewood. You tied it back together with a bootlace and prayer. Neither has aged well. You test it, gently. It doesn't ring so much as wheeze like an asthmatic ghost trying to yodel. You tug again. The rope comes loose entirely, plops down like it's had enough. And now it's just you, a silent bell, and a vague sense that if anyone attacks today, you're going to have to shout loudly, repeatedly, and with enough panic to travel uphill against the wind. You imagined a thrilling guard shift life or death urgency, a dramatic bell toll, maybe a duel on the ramparts. Instead, it's 4 hours of staring at snow, arguing with a crow. You try clapping your hands to stay warm. The sound echoes oddly, as if the stone wall is disappointed in your rhythm. The guard tower next to yours has already smoked out their brazier. You're not allowed one. Fire privileges were revoked last winter after someone's mittens caught fire during a card game. No one names names, but everyone looks at you when it's mentioned. Time crawls. Your toes no longer belong to you. They're honorary icicles now. The horizon doesn't change. You stare. It stares back. Your nose drips. No one cares. If the barbarians do come today, you hope they bring soup. You didn't plan to stay 30 years. At first, it was just posting a short assignment. Along the northern wall, meant to be character building, resume enhancing, and ideally brief. You were told the frontier needed strong eyes and stronger arms, that the enemy might appear at any moment. That your service was the thin line between civilization and chaos. So you packed your gear, tied your hopes into a threadbare satchel, and arrived in what could generously be called a fortified puddle. The first winter was hard, but survivable. You shivered, grumbled, adapted. The barracks leaked in 17 places, each drip keeping a kind of rhythm not musical, exactly, but persistent. Like the sound of boredom playing drums on your patience, you made friends. Or at least acquaintance who snored at a similar volume and didn't steal your socks. You kept watch. You trained. You built muscle in places you didn't know could ache. You studied the patterns of the trees beyond the wall, memorized the usual movements of deer and wind, convinced that one day, maybe tomorrow, the enemy would come. You stood your shifts with purpose. Eyes sharp, posture correct, jaw set just right for a statue they might one day carve in your honor. That was year 1. By year 7, the enemy still hadn't come. You knew the trees too well now, every branch, every shift in shadow. You stopped seeing danger and started seeing squirrels. The sword on your belt dulled slightly. You sharpened it, then again, and again. By the 50th sharpening, you weren't sure if you were preparing for war or simply giving your hand something to do while your mind frayed at the corners. Every season promised change, and every season failed to deliver it. A rumor would drift in with a supply cart, activity in the northern hills, or scouts went missing, or a footprint, larger than a man's, found near the creek. You'd straighten up. Get ready. Then nothing. The footprint turned out to be a collapsed rabbit warren. The scouts had just gotten drunk and slept in a bush. You started carving dice from bone, then stones, then anything that didn't move too fast. You etched tally marks onto your bed frame, then the wall, then your own boots. Your comrades rotated out. New faces appeared, full of tension and misplaced confidence. You tried to tell them not to wait too hard that time. Here is long, slow, and not particularly interested in justifying itself. Some listened. Most didn't. The worst part wasn't the waiting. It was the way the waiting became everything. Your identity shifted. You were no longer a soldier. You were a watcher of fog, a listener of silence, a custodian of invisible threats. You hadn't seen battle, hadn't drawn blood, hadn't tested your skill against anything but splinters and mild ankle injuries. Then, on year 30, the wind changed slightly. A branch cracked differently. Your ears perked up. Maybe this was it. Maybe today. But it was just the goat, again. The walls are old, but the scratches are older. Not in years, exactly in weariness. You don't notice them at first. They, tucked between cracks in the plaster, behind the soot-streaked corners of the guard tower, where your eye wouldn't naturally drift unless you were very bored. And you are. You are monumentally bored. So eventually you start looking. The first carving you find is crude. 2 stick figures fighting with swords, one clearly winning, the other dramatically bleeding from a square-shaped wound that looks suspiciously like someone ran out of space. Beneath it, the word Edric is scratched. Not boldly, but with the resigned energy of an who once believed this posting would be over by spring. You run your fingers over the lines. They're shallow but deliberate. Someone took their time. Someone stood in this exact spot, leaned against this exact wall, and tried to etch meaning, or maybe just distraction, into the stone. You start to see more. A face with exaggerated ears. A horse that looks more like a very confident dog. An extremely inappropriate limerick, scratched halfway into the plaster and left unfinished, either from guilt or because someone walked in mid-rhyme. It's everywhere. Once you start noticing it, the back of the door has tally marks, endless rows grouping in 5s, circling themselves like they're trying to count years, months, or perhaps just bowls of turnip stew endured. One stone near the window ledge has a tiny carved border grid for some sort of game, maybe invented during a particularly slow month. There are small grooves beside it, like places to set dice. You don't have real dice. You make your own. Everyone does. You take a bone from last night's roast, such as it was, and carve tiny dots into each side. The 6 is always a little too big. It throws the balance off, but no one minds. Fairness isn't the point. The point is motion. Something to do with your hands while your brain silently screams for variety. You play with the others when you can, betting with buttons, with dried berries, with imaginary debts that no one will collect. Someone always cheats. Someone always pretends not to notice. It's the rhythm that matters, the predictability, the ritual of pretending. This is all normal, all fine, all part of a grand strategy of wall-based defense that absolutely does not involve slowly going mad from staring at stones all day. When the centurion passes through, boots too clean, tunic too pressed, he tells you to scrub the graffiti off. You nod. You do not scrub it off. No one does. You just add yours lower down, a little less visible. A small drawing of a pig with a helmet. Maybe it's symbolic. Maybe it's just a pig. Either way, it stays. Because in this tower, where the wind never shuts up and the stew never improves, the only thing more permanent than the boredom is the need to leave a mark. Something to say, I was here. And yes, I was waiting too. He has a door. A real one, thick wood. Iron hinges and a latch that doesn't wiggle like a nervous tooth. It even closes fully, which is more than you can say for most of the tower's shutters, windows, or general sense of dignity. Behind that door is warmth, actual warmth, the kind that smells faintly of beeswax and smugness. You've only glimpsed it once, when he opened it a crack to shout at the quartermaster about oats. You saw cushions, plural, a fur throw, and what may have been a steaming cup of something that wasn't punishment in liquid form. The commander doesn't guard the wall. He oversees it from inside, while you stomp your frozen feet into the floorboards and develop an increasingly personal relationship with frostbite. He sits somewhere above you, surrounded by warmth and privacy, a word that, in your experience, might as well be a myth invented by nobles to sell tapestries. His room is sacred. Not in a religious way, but in the way sacred cows are sacred, untouchable, well-fed, and largely indifferent to the struggles of the common barn. The rules are simple. You don't knock unless summoned. You don't enter unless bidden. You don't ask why his tea always arrives hot, or how his ink never freezes mid-letter. You especially don't ask what he does all day, because the answer will involve important correspondence and strategic planning, which is military code, for being indoors while others suffer. No one knows how he gets fresh bread either, but he does. You smelled it once, a warm, yeasty betrayal drifting down the stairwell while you gnawed on something that may or may not have started life as a carrot. You could understand, maybe, if he were cruel. Cruelty is familiar. You know what to do with it. But the commander is polite. He nods. He says thank you. He occasionally inquires if you're warm enough, which is almost worse. When someone with fur-lined boots and a biscuit in their hand asks if your blanket, singular, is doing the trick, the only answer you can give is silence and a slow internal scream shaped like a soup ladle. The stories drift. That his quarters have rugs. That he has a tin of preserved cherries from a city no one's seen in years. That his brazier uses coal, not peat. That he once refused a promotion just so he wouldn't have to leave the room. You begin to believe the room is the real commander, and the man is just its chosen emissary. The warmth commands him. The cushions whisper counsel. One night, during the worst of the wind, the outer door slams open. A gale howls in like it. Has personal business with your spine. The commander's door does not move. It stays shut, resolute, like the universe has drawn a line and placed you very firmly on the wrong side of it. And somehow, you're not even angry. Not really. Because the truth is, someone has to be warm. Someone has to have a cushion. Otherwise, the rest of you might forget it's possible. You thought tea would be simple. Just hot water and a few leaves, right? That was before you tried boiling anything with wind screaming through the cracks, a fire that resents being lit, and fingers that feel more like icicles in mittens than parts of your body. The idea initially was comforting, a warm drink to soothe the soul and maybe distract you from the fact that your boots had taken on the personality of wet sponges with attitude. But boiling water at the wall is an act of stubborn defiance, not a kitchen task. It's a challenge issued to the elements, and frequently lost. You begin by scavenging fuel. Real wood is reserved for more important tasks, like keeping the commander's cherries from getting chilly, so you're stuck with peat clumps that crumble. Like old bread and smell like a swamp lost a bet. You pile them carefully, light the fire with flint that mostly insults you by sparking in the wrong direction, and shield it with your body. Like you're cradling a newborn made entirely of smoke and disappointment. Eventually it catches. Not brightly, not warmly, but enough to say it's trying. You place your dented tin pot over the flames. It tilts. Slightly one leg of your makeshift tripod is a bent fork you found behind the latrine last week, but it holds. The water inside is technically from a stream, but it carries a flavor profile somewhere between moss and regret. You boil it anyway. Boiling, after all, solves everything, except taste and temperature, and the fact that half your fingers are now stiff, enough to be used as tent pegs. The tea leaves come from a pouch you've been hoarding for weeks. They're brittle, broken, and possibly older than you are, but they're yours. You sprinkle them in, watching them swirl like little drownings. The smell rises faintly, just a whisper of earthiness beneath the dominant aroma of burning hair yours, probably. You pour it into a cup with a crack, down the side. It leaks if you hold it wrong, but you've learned the angle. You always learn the angle. You take a sip. It's hot, barely. It's tea, arguably. It tastes like boiled pond memories, with a hint of ash and something medicinal that probably comes from the cup's mysterious previous owner. But it's warm, and right now that counts for more than flavor. You wrap your fingers around the cup and pretend it helps. The warmth is fleeting, localized to your palms, but your brain, generous and hopeful, interprets this as comfort. You sit by the fire for as long as the flames permit, breathing in steam and imagining, just briefly, that this is luxury. Expectation whispered of calming tea ceremonies and soul-soothing brews. Reality offers mud water, with identity issues and an aftertaste of copper, but it's something. It's yours. And that, here on the edge of nowhere, is what passes for peace. The garrison was supposed to have a dog. A big one, sharp teeth, alert eyes, bark like thunder. That's what the supply clerk promised 2 winters ago, right before he got reassigned to somewhere warmer and significantly less honest. What you got instead was a goose. Not even a particularly large goose, just one, white, mean, and afflicted with the personality of a minor noble who didn't get invited to the right feast. The reasoning was explained, sort of. Geese are alert, they said. They honk at intruders. They require no training, no grooming, and almost never sleep on duty. Which, on paper, sounds ideal. What the paper fails to mention is that geese honk at everything. The wind, shadows, the moon, the sound of soup being stirred too loudly. Your face, especially your face. The goose, whom someone named Brutus for reasons that now seem too prophetic, has decided the watchtower is his domain. You're allowed in barely, but only if you acknowledge his superiority. With a respectful nod and 0 sudden movements, you tried to shoo him once. He bit your knee and declared war. Now you go around him. Everyone goes around him. The commander once came down to inspect the barracks, took one look at Brutus, and decided it wasn't worth the paperwork. To be fair, Brutus does his job. He notices everything. When the wind picks up and rattles the shutters, he flares his wings and hisses like a boiling kettle that's learned violence. When a fox slinks too close to the wall, Brutus is already halfway through launching an aerial assault, honking, with such intensity that the fox regrets every decision it's made since birth. He is terrifying, loud, unpredictable, and utterly unbothered by rank. The trouble is, you don't always know what he's honking at. Sometimes it's the enemy. Sometimes it's your scarf. Sometimes it's a bit of ice he doesn't trust. One night he honked for 2 hours straight. You suited up in full armor, thinking it was the long-feared invasion. It was a beetle. A very large, very shiny beetle. Brutus did not approve of its gait. And yet, somehow, you've grown used to him. You find yourself listening for the onks. You can tell when it's the something's near onk versus the your shadow moved weirdly honk. You interpret his feather ruffling like a scholar reading ancient scripts. He's not a companion. He's not a friend. He's a colleague in the loosest sense, with his own break schedule and a deeply flawed attitude. Expectation was a noble hound by your side, growling at unseen threats and comforting you during lonely watches. What you got was an onking feathered demon with opinions on footwear. But he's warm sometimes. He sleeps near the brazier, and you're allowed to sit beside him as long as you maintain appropriate goose etiquette. It's not quite trust. It's not quite peace. But when Brutus falls silent, truly silent, you sit up straighter, because for once, he's not screaming at shadows, and that means something might actually be out there. You were on fire duty that night. Not in the glorious sense of charging into battle with a torch and righteous fury, no. You were assigned to keep the brazier alive. The small pit of embers, everyone clustered around like moths with terrible posture. It was your job to feed it, nurse it, protect it from the jealous fingers of the wind that never really left. A simple task, really. Keep the fire burning. Or at least, keep it from dying in the middle of the coldest night the wall had produced in recent memory. You failed. Spectacularly. The shift began like any other. You added peat. You stirred it gently with a bent poker that someone once used to cook something that probably wasn't meat. You propped your boots near the warmth. Not too close lessons learned from the melted sock incident, and tried to stay awake. The tower creaked. Brutus honked once in his sleep. All was calm. Then the moon came out. A full moon, glowing with that arrogant brightness that only the truly useless sources of light possess. It cast everything in silver and shadows, made the stone floor look like water, and made your eyes feel like they'd forgotten how to blink. It was beautiful, in the way that things are when you're freezing and sleep-deprived and prone to temporary affection. For anything that isn't made of turnips. You got distracted, just for a moment. Maybe two. When you looked back down, the fire was no longer burning. It wasn't even glowing. It was sulking. A sullen pile of darkened ash, with a single ember flickering like it was thinking about dying just to spite you. You scrambled, blew into it, whispered sweet, panicked nothings, fed it dried moss which smoked pitifully, tried to coax a spark from damp twigs that hissed like offended cats. Nothing. You didn't panic at first. Not openly. You still had a spark stone. After all flint and steel, your last hope and worst tools. You struck. And struck again. Sparks flew. Every one of them bounced off the kindling like an insult. Your fingers went numb halfway through. Your breath came in clouds, not prayers. The moon watched silently. Expectation, you tend the fire all night, maybe write a song about endurance, become legend. Reality, you curse at pebbles, while trying to reignite warmth with two fingers that have forgotten they're part of your body. Eventually, you gave up. You wrapped yourself in every wool scrap you could find, and sat miserably in the corner, glaring at the moon as if it had personally extinguished your fire out of spite. You began to blame it. Its light had distracted you. Its brightness had lulled you into a moment of peace which was clearly a trap. You muttered accusations at it under your breath. Treacherous orb, glow-faced traitor, ice witch's eye. The others woke shivering. They asked what happened. You didn't lie. You just gestured vaguely at the sky and said the moon was too bright. Nobody questioned it, because on the wall, sometimes, that's just how it goes. You don't expect luxury out here. You don't expect comfort. You've long since stopped expecting flavor, dry socks, or conversations that don't involve someone coughing halfway through. But you did foolishly, naively expect a toilet. Not a nice one, not even a wooden seat, just a hole with boundaries, a bit of distance from the living quarters, and ideally, some kind of system that didn't make you question every decision that led you to this exact moment, holding your breath. while trying not to tip forward into the abyss. The latrine is not a facility. It's a suggestion. A trench dug with more optimism than skill, deep enough to seem safe until you realize. The walls are slowly caving in. It has no cover, no shelter. Just a piece of rope nailed between two half-rotten posts, a gesture toward balance, not a guarantee of it. It sways in the wind like a particularly lazy snake, and you cling to it like your dignity depends on it, because it does. You make the journey with purpose. No one strolls to the trench. It is a mission. Hood pulled low, eyes averted, you carry your scrap of cloth, not soft, not clean, but nominally yours. The ground is uneven, wet. You think about slipping. You always think about slipping. It's a mental rehearsal that plays on loop. One misplaced step, and you become a story no one wants to tell, but everyone will repeat. A soldier swallowed by his own post. The smell hits before you arrive. It's not just bad, it's philosophical. It reaches deep into your soul and asks questions like, are you proud of where you've ended up? And what is the price of civilization? You try to breathe through your mouth, but the air is thick, moist, full of betrayal. You gag once, twice. The goose honks somewhere in the distance, possibly in mockery. You position yourself carefully, crouched just right to avoid disaster, but not so precariously that a gust of wind could make you a legend for all the wrong reasons. Your legs cramp. Your knees tremble. The rope creaks ominously. This is not a private moment. It is a public performance of balance, timing, and regret. You finish as fast as humanly possible. And the relief is brief, not because you feel better, but because you are no longer in mortal peril. Expectation, a crude but manageable outhouse. Reality, a trench of doom, guarded by unstable ground and moral compromise. Someone once suggested building a proper seat. They brought planks. The planks were stolen by morning, turned into firewood, or dice, or both. The commander says new supplies are delayed. You know better. The wall doesn't get better. It just gets colder. You return to the barracks a little humbler, a little filthier. You scrub your hands with sand and shame. And as you settle back into your blanket, the only thing you truly hope for more than warmth, more than peace, is that tomorrow it doesn't rain. You check the post table every week, even though you know better. It's a slab of stone near the commander once used to serve bread, now used to deliver silence in envelope form. A wooden box beneath it holds messages wrapped in oilskin, most of them damp, delayed, or deeply irrelevant. Still, you check. Hope is persistent, like a splinter that never quite leaves the skin. You know your sister wrote, or your cousin, or someone who still remembers you were supposed to be home 3 winters ago. This week, again, there's nothing. You shuffle through the contents, just in case someone filed your name wrong, under private or pitiful, or pending transfer that never came. A message for Marcus, 2 for Decius, one written in a hand so careful, it looks forged by guilt. None for you. You pretend not to mind. You shrug and mutter something about postal delays, then go back to your post and tell yourself that letters are overrated. And maybe the ones you're waiting for simply never left the village. Expectation, word from home. Reality, word from someone else's home, wrapped in melancholy and delivered on damp parchment. Later, a letter does arrive. But it's not yours. It's addressed to the commander and left open, casually, as if privacy was optional, and curiosity wasn't a daily meal on the wall. You glance. You always glance. The first lines are harmless formal greetings, a mention of weather. Then comes a phrase that sticks. Resign him if possible. His presence has caused more confusion than order. The name below it is someone you know. Too well. The letter wasn't for you, but now it's in your mind like ash in your tea. You begin to replay conversations, every odd look, every subtle pause when your name came up in duty assignments. You wonder if your misfired joke about the latrine trench made it into a report. You think about the training exercise, where you tripped and knocked over 3 spears and 1 very surprised goose. You consider whether confusion is code for mildly inconvenient or potential threat to morale. You didn't want letters like this. You wanted ones that said, "We miss you," or "The roof still leaks," or "Tell us again about the goose with the attitude problem." You wanted reminders of who you were before all this, before the wall taught you how to feel forgotten in 3 languages. But the wall doesn't trade in nostalgia. It deals in omissions. Sometimes you write letters of your own, short ones, just enough to fold into a small pouch and send with the next supply cart, assuming it doesn't get lost in snow or bureaucracy, or someone else's fire. You never get a reply, but you keep writing them because the act of sending is sometimes enough, like dropping a coin into a well. You don't expect a wish. You just want to hear the echo. Sleep on the wall is neither deep nor generous. It arrives slowly, like a bored visitor who isn't sure they're welcome, and leaves at the first sound of boots or a falling spoon. Your bed is a wooden platform with straw stuffed into a sack that gave up being soft sometime last autumn. You roll onto your side, but the plank creaks, like a betrayed ship, and the draft under the door insists on hugging your ankles. Still, you try. Sleep is the only thing that doesn't have a rank here. It treats everyone equally when it comes. You never plan to dream, but you do. Not of battle, not of glory, and not of home. Exactly not the real version, with its arguments and unpayable debts and goats with boundary issues. No, you dream about the idea of home. A roof that doesn't leak. A bowl of stew that smells like food, not endurance. A face that knows your name and says it without hesitation. In the dream, it's summer. Always summer. No armor, no mud. Just warmth, and the quiet miracle of no one needing anything from you. Sometimes you dream about the horizon, the one you stare at every day, but in sleep it's different. Not empty. There are shapes moving through the mist, not enemies. Not quite. People. Possibilities. The future wearing borrowed coats. They wave sometimes. You never wave back. You wake up just before they reach the wall. There are stranger dreams too. Once, you dreamed the wall spoke to you. Not with words, but in pulses. A kind of deep stone rhythm that thudded through your bones like a second heartbeat. It didn't say anything useful, just reminded you that it was always here, and always would be. Even after your name had been forgotten, and your bones turned into something moss might consider furniture. Expectation tells you that soldiers dream of valor, of triumph, of songs sung in their name. Reality is you dreaming of a bed that doesn't creak and tea that doesn't betray you. You dream of sitting still without duty breathing down your neck. Of eating without a horn blast interrupting. Of speaking without checking first to see who might be listening. You never talk about these dreams. Not out loud. No one does. Not because they're shameful, but because they're so fragile. Saying them aloud might break them, might make someone laugh, or worse, agree. And then the dream stops being a secret. It becomes a plan. And plans on the wall have a terrible survival rate. So you keep dreaming quietly. You fold those fragments between your ribs, carry them like contraband past Brutus the goose and the morning fog. You wrap yourself in them when the cold won't leave, and the sky refuses to change. They're not hope, exactly. They're not despair either. They're just what you see when there's nothing else left to look at. They told you it would be a short posting. 1 winter, maybe 2, just until reinforcements arrived. Just until the treaty held. Just until something happened, though no one could quite explain what that something might be. You were young, then young enough to believe that orders made sense, that timelines meant anything, and that someone higher up was keeping track of your name on a very important list somewhere. You packed light. A spare pair of socks, a blanket, a letter from someone who might have loved you once. The first snow came early. It wasn't majestic. It was damp, slushy. It felt like an accident and stuck like a grudge. The barracks weren't ready. The windows didn't close properly. The roof leaked. The floor absorbed moisture the way sadness soaks into silence thoroughly and without apology. You spent your first week rearranging straw, trying to create a dry spot wide enough for your spine. You failed. Everyone fails. You learned to sleep in shapes that make no anatomical sense. Food was strange too. You expected hardship, sure, but you thought there would be structure. Instead, meals arrived at odd hours, bowls of something too hot or too cold, too salty or mysteriously sweet. The bread came hard enough to repel small arrows. The stew had a personality. Once, you swore it moved. But you ate it anyway, because you were hungry, and your hunger didn't care whether your taste buds survived the experience. Training filled the rest of your time. Endless drills in snow that stuck to your boots like guilt. Marching, turning, saluting. A blur of commands barked by men who forgot your name, but remembered your mistakes. You tried to keep your sword sharp, your posture correct, your face impassive. You developed the kind of discipline that looked like virtue but mostly came from exhaustion. Expectation said you'd prove yourself by spring, maybe earn promotion, or at least respect. But winter dragged on like a bad conversation, and when spring came, it was late, bitter, and barely warmer. The commander said the roads were still too dangerous for rotation. The caravans didn't arrive. The replacements didn't come. No one left. You were still here. And that was when it began to settle in the sense that this might be longer than planned. Not a short stop, not a temporary inconvenience, but a chapter. A season that wouldn't end when the flowers bloomed because the flowers weren't blooming. Not here, not near the wall. You started counting days, then stopped when the numbers made your stomach twist. You told yourself stories about the day you'd leave. You imagined stepping onto a road again, hearing birds that didn't sound like warnings, seeing colours that warnings, tonestone and frost. You didn't believe them, not really. But you needed something to say to yourself before sleep, and still, no enemy came. Just the wind, just the snow, just the steady, silent repetition of surviving a post you weren't meant to stay in not this long, not like this. His name was Lucan. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe that was just what he told everyone, because who checks at the wall? Names become flexible here, reshaped by accent, by laziness, by the slow erosion of proper introductions. But Lucan is what you called him, and he responded to it with a grin sharp enough to slice turnips. He arrived in the middle of your second winter, teeth chattering, eyes too alert, and boots that clearly used to belong to someone braver or colder already dead. You didn't mean to become friends. No one means to, not here. Friendship is risky. It involves expectation. But it started with a shared joke, something about the commander's cloak looking like it had lost a fight with a goat and then another. And then, suddenly, you were laughing more than you should have been. Not full laughter, not joy. But the kind that slips out sideways when everything else is too grim to survive. Lucan was fast with dice, faster with excuses. He claimed to have once outrun a tax collector, a vengeful ex, and an entire chicken coop that collapsed under mysterious circumstances. You never believed half of what he said, but it didn't matter. He was good at talking. And talking was the only currency that never ran out. You played cards with him using stained parchment and rules that changed mid-hand. You lost often. He swore often. And both of you understood the ritual more than the game. One night you shared a ration of dried apples. They were terrible, chewy, fibrous, possibly older than either of you. But he said they tasted like his grandmother's orchard. You almost believed him, because in that moment, it didn't matter if the orchard was real. What mattered was remembering something sweet, even if it came with a layer of frost and dust. Then he changed. Slowly. Quietly. It wasn't dramatic. He just started laughing less, sleeping more, or not sleeping at all. His jokes became sharp in the wrong way, not playful, but pointed. Not clever, but bitter. You asked once if he was all right. He said yes, then stared at the fire like he couldn't remember why it was burning. Expectation told you that comradeship was enough, that a good joke and a warm drink could ward off the dark. Reality showed you a man curling inward, slowly, like paper over an open flame. He missed roll call one morning. They found him sitting behind the latrine trench, not doing anything, just sitting, staring. The commander called it fatigue, gave him 3 days rest. But Lucan never came back to the jokes. He still sat with you sometimes, still played dice, but his eyes stopped lighting up when he cheated. His laugh, when it came, sounded borrowed, worn. You stopped expecting him to brighten. You didn't stop sitting beside him. Because here on the wall, where time folds in strange ways and the sky doesn't always change, sometimes the only thing you can give someone is presence. Not help, not healing, just staying, quietly, until they notice the fire again. At first it was a game, a small ritual. Every morning, just after roll call, and just before pretending to care about stew, you'd take the knife from your boot and scratch a single line into the wall behind your bunk. The stone was soft enough, just crumbly enough to take the mark without much effort. You did it carefully, evenly. Not too long, not too short. One notch for each day survived, one more tiny act of control in a life that seemed increasingly allergic to logic. Others joined in. Some used charcoal, some used nails. One person, probably Brennus, with his flair for drama, tried ink until it ran out halfway through a week and stained the corner in a way that made the room look like someone had coughed up midnight. You didn't compare tallies. That wasn't the point. This wasn't about who had lasted longest. It was about counting, about confirming that time was still moving, even if it crept, even if it limped. The marks formed rows, neat at first, then ragged. Some curved, some overlapped. Some were just gouges, deeper than necessary. Some were doubled, as if someone wasn't sure they'd scratched the day before, and decided to hedge their bet against forgetting. It didn't matter. Each one was a little act of defiance. You're still here. You still exist. The wall hasn't eaten you. Yet. But then, after a few years, yes, years, though no one said the number out loud, the marks started feeling heavier. Not literally, but each time you pressed the blade to the stone, your hand hesitated. Was this another day you wanted to remember? Another line in a row of hundreds that all looked the same. You found yourself staring at them longer, trying to remember what day it had been when you carved that one, or that one, or the 1-2 inches to the left with a slightly jagged edge, and you couldn't. Expectation said the marks would give you meaning, structure, a record. Reality? They began to feel like echoes you couldn't place. You started skipping days. First by accident, then on purpose. Then you stopped altogether. The wall remains, though. Your old lines still there, faded slightly, but visible. Sometimes a new recruit comes in, sees them, and starts scratching their own. You don't stop them. You don't explain. Let them count. Let them feel like they're documenting something that will matter. Maybe it will. You've moved on to different rituals. Folding your blanket the same way every morning. Whispering the same sentence to the fire when it flares up. Tapping the hilt of your sword twice before stepping into the wind. Small rhythms that don't require stone or memory. Things you can carry in your body, not on the wall. Because now you understand the wall doesn't care how many days you've marked. Only that you keep standing. It wasn't addressed to you. That much was clear. The name on the outside was written in firm, elegant ink, not the scribbled, frostbitten hand of a soldier's sibling, but something official. Script that smelled of candles and expectations. The wax seal was half cracked already, the insignia blurred. Someone had tossed it onto the post table without care, probably assuming it would be picked up by the right person, at the right time, in the right mood. But no one claimed it. Days passed. Then a week. It sat there like a secret that wanted to be found. And eventually you picked it up. You didn't mean to read it. Not exactly. You meant to move it aside, or perhaps hold it long enough to feel important by proximity. But the edge had already split open. A thin tear, like a mouth halfway through a sentence. Your thumb caught it, widened it. You didn't stop. You told yourself if it was dangerous you should know. If it was urgent, it shouldn't have been left alone. Inside, only a few sentences. Polite, reserved. The kind of calm that means something isn't being said. The writer spoke of reassignment. A request made. A delay caused. A concern raised about recent behavior and emotional resilience. No names beyond the recipient. No context, but you knew. Somehow you knew. It was about one of yours. Maybe Brennus, with his ink-stained fingers. Maybe Lucan, who had stopped laughing months ago. Maybe even you, though that seemed absurd. Why would someone write about you? You'd been here too long to cause a stir. You were part of the wall now, part of the scenery, as likely to be reassigned as the floorboards under your bunk. Expectation whispered it might be a misunderstanding, bureaucratic fluff, something misfiled or misread. Reality? Someone had noticed something. Someone somewhere far away, with a chair and a desk and too much parchment, was watching. Or at least they had watched. Once. And they had opinions. You folded the letter. Carefully. No creases. No signs. You returned it to the table. Pressed it flat. Let it vanish under new deliveries. And then you didn't mention it. To anyone. But something stayed with you. A question, thin and persistent. What would happen if they followed through? If someone came to collect the person mentioned, what then? Would the wall feel emptier? Would it breathe easier? Would anyone notice at all? You started looking at people differently. You watched how they walked, how long they stared into the fire, how often they blinked when silence fell too hard. You noticed who folded their blanket, who didn't, who asked about letters, who stopped asking. You never read another letter, but you always checked the names, every time, because the wall doesn't speak, not directly. But sometimes it leaves you a piece of paper and expects you to listen anyway. They weren't yours, not originally. The boots had belonged to the man stationed before you, a soldier named Hadrian, or maybe Hadric, or something close enough that the name felt familiar, even if the face didn't. He'd left in a hurry, or at least that's what the others said. No ceremony, no farewell. Just gone. One morning his bunk was empty, and by evening someone else had already taken the better blanket. No one asked where he went. On the wall, you don't ask questions like that out loud. You just adjust to the shape of the absence. The boots were left under his cot, stiff, cracked, mud-stained. One had a hole in the sole, patched with something that looked suspiciously like a piece of leather torn from a glove. But they were better than what you had. Your pair was barely holding together with string. Spite. And the hope that frostbite only took the polite toes first. So you tried his on. They fit. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but closely enough to feel like fate had a sarcastic sense of humor. You told yourself it was temporary. Just until your own boots could be repaired. Just until supplies came. Just until. But they never got fixed, and the supply cart never brought anything in your size again. Winter rolled into spring. Spring forgot to stay. The boots stayed with you. Over time, you learned their quirks. The way the left one pinched your heel if you walked downhill too fast. The way the right one squeaked after rain. You stuffed straw inside them when the lining wore through. Wrapped cloth around your ankles to keep them from bruising. You began to walk differently, not better, just in ways that caused less complaint from the leather. The boots shaped your stride, your posture, your pace. Expectation told you a soldier's kit was his own, fitted, maintained, respected. Reality taught you that ownership fades here. Everything is shared eventually. Your coat once belonged to a deserter. Your blanket still has someone else's initials stitched near the hem. Even your bowl has a chip shaped like a tooth you're fairly certain wasn't yours. Still, the boots are different. You've grown attached. Not because they're good, they're not, but because they've lasted. They've carried you through 3 winters, 300 shifts, and more than a few nights, where your only comfort was knowing at least one thing under you wasn't completely falling apart. That counts for something. Maybe more than it should. Sometimes you wonder what happened to their original owner. If he left willingly. If he got reassigned. If he's still alive. You imagine meeting him someday and handing the boots back. But the truth is you wouldn't. Not now. These boots know your feet too well. And the wall knows better than to give something twice. So you keep them. Not because they're yours, but because no one else came back to claim them. And because here, sometimes, survival means walking in someone else's footsteps long enough that they become your own. It started with a rumor. They often do. A whisper passed over a bowl of grey stew, traded in low voices behind the barracks, repeated with the quiet urgency of something too fragile to shout. A gap in the watch rotation. A missed check-in from the eastern post. A path, not an official one, but a trail beaten down by deer, by time, by someone brave or foolish or both. Supposedly, it led to a valley. Supposedly, the valley had a road. Supposedly, the road had travellers. All of it, of course, was vague and entirely unverifiable, but it was something, and something was rare. You spent the next 3 days trying not to think about it, but you did, constantly. You imagined the path, winding and quiet, wrapped in shadows the wall had never seen. You imagined stepping off the stone walkway and onto soft earth. No sentries, no commands. No Brutus the goose eyeing you like a suspicious god. Just you, your boots, and the possibility that somewhere beyond this frozen outpost, a different life was still unfolding without you. It wasn't escape. Not exactly. You weren't planning desertion. Not in any formal way. You just thought maybe if you walked for a bit, found a different place, took a few days, then came back, it wouldn't count. A pause. A breath. Not abandonment, he'd return. Probably. So one morning, long before the others stirred, you gathered your things. Not much. A crust of bread, a half-dry cloak, a dagger with a bent tip. You slipped out past the watch point, where the snow had frozen into a crust that crunched if you stepped wrong. You didn't. You walked carefully, slowly, breathing through your nose to avoid fogging the air around your face. Even the cold felt quieter. You reached the edge of the trees. Just beyond them, a darkness too natural to belong to this place. The trees bent slightly inward, as if listening. You stood there, unsure, heart pounding not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that you could do it. You could walk away, right now, and then you heard it. A horn, far in the distance. Not an alarm, just the morning call, but familiar. The sound folded into your ribs like something remembered. You turned back. Not quickly. Not dramatically. You just turned. Walked back toward the wall, where the stones waited with no judgment, no questions. Just duty and cold, and the rhythm of boots on old paths. Expectation said the moment would be grand. A choice made with thunder and certainty. Reality was quieter. A pause. A glance. A step backward. You returned before anyone noticed you'd left. Brutus looked at you with mild suspicion. The stew was still warm. You sat down. You ate in silence. And you told yourself maybe tomorrow. Maybe some other time. And even as you said it, you knew you wouldn't try again. You'd been waiting for weeks. Everyone had. It wasn't just about food, though, that was part of it. You could live with stale bread and dubious turnips. You'd done it before. But this cart was supposed to bring the essentials. Replacements. Repairs. Letters. Things that didn't taste like damp wool or look like a mistake. The promise had been made by a man with a clipboard and the terrifying confidence of someone who had never slept on straw in a leaking roof, while their boots conspired against them. When the cart finally arrived, it looked like hope had lost a bet. The wheels wobbled like they were trying to detach themselves and roll in opposite directions. The ox pulling it seemed to be held together by willpower and mild spite. The driver wore the blank, weathered expression of someone who had been ignored too many times by people who out-retranked him, but couldn't lift a bucket. Still, it was here. Everyone gathered around like bees around something that might be a flower or might be garbage that smelled vaguely sweet. The first thing unloaded, 8 barrels of salted fish. The smell hit you like a wet sock filled with complaints. Fish wasn't even on the request list. No one could figure out where it came from, or why it looked slightly translucent in the light. The second item, a sack of mismatched gloves. Not pairs, just gloves. Some left-handed. Some clearly made for children. One was embroidered with a swan, which someone tried to claim for reasons of morale. Next came paper. Reams of it. Soggy, curling at the edges, printed with forms no one understood. At least half had already been filled out, in someone else's handwriting, in a language none of you recognized. When you asked the driver, he shrugged and said it came from Central. You didn't ask which Central. It didn't matter. The cart did include a box of letters. That, at least, felt like victory. But most were addressed to names that had long since left the wall reassigned, vanished, or forgotten. A few were clearly misdelivered, addressed to outposts 3 valleys over. One letter had been opened and resealed with wax that smelled suspiciously of cheese. You got one envelope, blank inside. It might have once had words. You held it anyway. Expectation told you the supply cart would bring relief, maybe even joy. Something useful. Something warm. Reality handed you fish, ghost letters, and a glove that fit only 2 fingers if you folded one sideways. At the bottom of the cart, someone found a crate of spoons. Clean, identical, polished. Too many spoons. No bowls. Not a single bowl. The commander said it was a clerical error. You suspect it was a metaphor, but you're too tired to decide what it meant. Later, over supper, someone stirred their stew with a spoon for the first time in a month. They cried a little. You didn't ask why. Sometimes, a spoon is all it takes to remember how close you are to breaking and how stubborn you are about not doing so. It began with the wind stopping. Not fading, not shifting, stopping. Like someone had taken a knife and sliced it out of the air. You noticed it while on watch, mid-step, mid-thought, with one hand on the cold stone of the parapet and the other inside your sleeve, nursing the slow ache of knuckles turned brittle by frost. You paused, listened again. Nothing. Not even the faint rattle of the tower shutters or the rhythmic wheeze of the brazier in the room below. No snoring. No goose honking. Just silence, thick, padded, unsettling. You didn't realize how loud the wall was until it stopped. The groans of timber, the endless creak of damp leather, the hiss of snow against stone, all of it had been background noise, a steady lullaby of wear and erosion. But tonight, the wall wasn't singing. It was listening. You could feel it in your chest, in the base of your teeth, in the part of your spine that always flinched right before something fell. Even the stars seemed to be waiting. Someone else noticed. You caught a flicker of movement in the adjacent tower, just a shadow shifting, followed by the soft tap of boots against stone. A signal, unspoken, you feel it too. Yes, definitely. You adjusted your grip on your spear, not because it would help, but because doing nothing felt too loud. Expectation said the quiet should be calming, a break from the wind, a reprieve. But reality twisted it into something else, a question you didn't want to answer. What if silence wasn't peace? What if it meant something was already inside the walls? You scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The shadows stayed where they were supposed to. The moonlight didn't flicker. Brutus didn't honk. That was the worst part. Brutus always honked. At shadows, dreams, his own reflection in puddles. But tonight, nothing. You checked. He was awake, eyes open, alert, but utterly silent. Like he too had decided sound would be a mistake. Someone lit a second torch. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't even particularly useful. But the extra light felt like a boundary, a line drawn between the wall and whatever might be watching from beyond. You stepped closer to it without thinking. Warmth wasn't the point. It was the brightness, the definition, the reminder that things still had edges. Hours passed. No alarm. No attack. Nothing at all. Just silence, long and breathless, stretching over the stone like a new layer of frost. By morning, the wind returned. So did the sounds, the groan of boots, the sigh of doors, the distant grumble of someone realizing the stew was cabbage again. No one mentioned the night. Not directly. But you could see it in the way everyone moved slower, more careful, as if afraid they might shatter something fragile that hadn't broken yet. The wall had gone quiet. And now, you understood why that was more terrifying than any noise it had ever made. Fog wasn't unusual. You'd grown used to it, the way it slithered between towers like an old dog with nowhere better to be. Most mornings it arrived uninvited, curled around boots, softened the edge of the watchposts, made everything seem slightly more tolerable if you squinted just right, but it always left. By mid-morning, or noon at the latest, it drifted away like a lazy guest who finally took the hint. This time, it stayed. It arrived before sunrise on the first day, thick and pale like someone had poured milk across the valley. You woke to the sound of muffled footsteps and voices that echoed strangely, distant but too close, like the walls themselves were rehearsing conversations without telling you. You stepped outside and couldn't see the edge of the courtyard, just a wall of shifting white. The air felt wrong. Not cold exactly, not warm either. Just heavy, like breathing through wool. You tasted dampness. You smelled moss and stone and something faintly sweet, like old fruit left in a drawer. You waited for it to burn off. Everyone did. But noon came, and the sky remained blank. You stood your post, straining to see 5 feet in front of you, wondering if it even mattered. At some point you stopped watching for shapes and started listening harder. Every creak, every footstep, every scrape of cloth on stone felt louder, not because they were, but because they were all you had. Expectation told you the fog would lift. It always did. Reality handed you 3 full days where time blurred, and the world shrank to a few feet of visibility and the steady suspicion that you were not alone, not quite. You saw movement. Always just at the edge. A shadow too tall to be Brutus. A ripple that could have been a trick of light. One moment you were sure someone whispered your name. You turned. Nothing. But still, your name hung there, like smoke that refused to rise. Sleep came strangely during those days. Shallower than usual, interrupted by dreams that were more echoes than images. You dreamed of paths you couldn't follow, of faces pressed against the fog, of being watched by something that didn't blink. You told no one. You didn't have to. Everyone else had the same look, tired eyes that stared too hard at nothing. When the fog finally lifted, it didn't fade. It vanished. One moment you were surrounded, and the next, the entire valley was visible again, every tree, every crooked rock, every watchtower down the line, standing there like they'd never disappeared. The sky above was suddenly blue. Not bright, not joyful, just unapologetically open. You blinked against the sudden clarity. Everything felt too sharp, like a page turned too quickly. Even the colours seemed rude. You rubbed your eyes and found them sore, not from sleep, but from squinting into absence for so long. You looked around. The others had come out too. One by one, soldiers emerged from bunk rooms, stairwells, corners they disappeared into like mist themselves. No one said anything at first. There was no joke, no curse, no grumble about soup or boots, or the commander's suspiciously warm quarters. Just silence, not the heavy silence of the fog, but the stretched kind that lives after something strange has passed through and left everything in the wrong place. Someone tried to laugh. It came out like a cough. Someone else tried to speak and stopped after the first word. Even Brutus the goose seemed unsure of the atmosphere. He fluffed his feathers once and waddled in circles, honking only once, very quietly, as if unsure whether it was allowed. That evening, the commander gave a short speech. You don't remember the words. Something about weather anomalies, staying alert, filing reports. But nobody cared, because everyone knew the wall had held its breath for 3 days. And when it finally exhaled, it didn't explain why it had stopped. Later that night, you talked less and listened more. You wrapped yourself in your cloak tighter than usual, lit your brazier a little earlier, and sat facing the valley. Not because you expected something, not exactly, but because now you understood the fog didn't need to hide anything to be terrifying. It only had to stay. Expectation had taught you to fear things you could see, a shadow over the ridge, a sound in the night, a shape that didn't belong. But now you knew better. Reality was slower, quieter. It was what happened when everything familiar became uncertain, and no one could say for sure if it had ever left. And though the fog was gone, a part of you still watched for it in every cloud, every misty breath on a cold morning, every low roll of weather across the hills. You didn't dread it exactly, but you didn't trust it either. Not anymore. You had imagined it 1,000 times. The horns would sound. The watchtower would shake with urgency. Boots would thunder on the stone. Soldiers shouting, weapons drawn, adrenaline rushing in thick waves that could drown fear before it had time to hatch. You saw yourself leaping into action, steady, calm, just scared enough to be human, but brave enough to be remembered. For years, The idea of invasion was the heartbeat beneath the boredom, the thing that justified the waiting, the drills, the endless stew. And then one morning it happened. Sort of. There was no horn, no thunder, just a clatter not loud, not urgent, but unmistakably wrong. You were on the eastern wall, inspecting a rope that had decided to disintegrate one thread at a time, when you heard it. Not a scream, not even a shout. Just the sound of something falling that wasn't supposed to fall. A stone, maybe, or a helmet, or a plan. You looked over the edge and saw them. 5 figures. No banners. No formation. No armor, really just cloaks, bundles, tired feet. They weren't running or charging. They were climbing the slope awkwardly, slipping on rocks, helping one another like drunk travelers who'd taken the long road by mistake. One of them waved, not in greeting, just acknowledgement. You called for backup anyway, because protocol is stronger than doubt. Reinforcements came with weapons half drawn and faces full of expectation. And then they saw. Not raiders. Not warriors, just people. Tired, thin, carrying sacks instead of swords. They looked more lost than dangerous. The commander ordered them detained. He used the word questioned, but everyone heard contained. You watched as they were brought inside. One limped. One kept coughing. The youngest one couldn't have been more than 16, stared at the wall like it was a god, and he was too small to worship it properly. That evening, you learned they weren't invaders at all. Just a group of villagers from beyond the border, fleeing something worse, a burned settlement, bandits, a sickness no one wanted to name. They hadn't come to conquer. They'd come because they didn't know where else to go. Because from the outside, the wall still looked like protection. Expectation promised you glory, a chance to prove yourself. Reality handed you 5 frightened strangers and a report to fill out about unauthorized border crossings. There was no battle, no blood, just confusion, quiet, the strange discomfort of holding a spear in front of someone who looks like they haven't eaten in days. You still think about that moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. Because it made you wonder if the real enemy was ever going to show up, or if you'd just spend the rest of your life preparing for something that never quite arrives. Maybe the wall doesn't keep danger out. Maybe it just keeps you in. You found it behind the water barrel, or what passes for a water barrel, which is to say a container that sometimes holds water and always smells faintly of mildew, iron, and ambition gone soft. The scratch was shallow but deliberate. Carved into the stone wall just above where the mould usually blooms in polite green clusters. It said, 2 goats walk into a wall. One of them gets promoted. That was it. No explanation. No signature. No date. Just those words, etched with something sharp and confident, like the person who wrote them expected laughter. Or confusion. Or maybe both. You stared at it for a long time. You tried to make sense of it. Was it a metaphor? A warning? A dig at the commander? Was one of the goats meant to represent someone in particular? You pictured Brutus in a helmet, then immediately regretted that image. Maybe it had no meaning at all. Maybe the act of scratching it in was the point, not the joke itself. Later you asked around. No one claimed it. Some claimed to have seen it, but only after you did. One soldier said he thought it referred to a failed livestock patrol, which was a real thing, apparently. Another said it was part of a longer joke, the rest of which had flaked off in last winter's freeze. You nodded politely. You didn't believe either of them. What mattered was that someone had taken the time. In a place where time was often something to be endured rather than spent, carving anything into stone felt like a declaration, a small rebellion, a slow whisper into the future. I was here. I had thoughts, and at least one of them involved goats. Expectation says history is recorded in books, scrolls, proclamations. Reality says it also lives in graffiti, the awkward, half-finished, quietly desperate kind left behind by bored people with too many hours and too few options. There's more if you look. On the underside of a bunk slat, if you read this, you're on latrine deity. On the back of a stair, a crude drawing of what might be a fish, or a badly misunderstood horse. Near the watchtower entrance, don't trust anyone who still eats the stew. That one gets re-etched every few weeks. You start noticing the jokes more. They become part of your rounds. A map of quiet humor passed from hand to hand, scratched into places the commander never sees or pretends not to. You even consider writing your own. Something short, something odd, something to confuse the next poor soul staring at mildew and wondering why goats deserve promotion. But you don't write it. Not yet. You're still working on the wording. You want it to be just confusing enough to last. Because out here on this wall, time forgets people, but sometimes stone remembers jokes. You didn't have real dice. No one did. The last set went missing sometime during the Great Stew protest of Year 6, which is a dramatic way of saying someone probably dropped them in the latrine and chose silence over retrieval. But the game didn't stop. It couldn't. Because when you're stuck on a wall that forgets your name, the dice aren't just game pieces, they're little instruments of sanity. They give the illusion of luck, of chance, of something happening that wasn't scheduled. So, you improvised. You carved dice from bits of bone chicken, probably, though one was suspiciously round for anything poultry-related. Others used wood scraps. Someone even tried to paint pips on a lump of dried bread until it crumbled mid-roll, and took the rules with it. When materials ran out, you pretended. Invisible dice. Called out numbers based on vibes, honor, or which direction the wind was coming from. It worked for a while. Until it didn't. The argument started slow. At first it was minor, a raised eyebrow, a skeptical grunt. "You're telling me you rolled 2 6s?" Again. You'd smile. Say something about fate, or Brutus's honk being lucky. It passed. Until one night, a particularly long game of 6 toss, and a bowl, a name that changes weekly, whose rules change nightly, devolved into a shouting match over whether an invisible 4 could beat a declared 5 if the candle had flickered at the exact moment the number was said. Expectation says soldiers argue over strategy, over battlefield formations, over glory. Reality says they argue over imaginary dice and stew portions. You tried to keep the peace. You reminded everyone that the dice weren't real, that the game was meant to distract, not divide. But logic doesn't last long at the wall. Not when boredom festers in corners like mold with opinions. Someone tried to make official house rules, carved them into a plank with great ceremony. Brutus ate the plank the next morning. No one questioned it. Eventually, someone suggested flipping spoons instead. This led to a week of spoon gambling, wildly ineffective, but visually entertaining. A good flip could earn a day's biscuit. A bad one might cost you your gloves. People flipped spoons off elbows, from window ledges, across soup bowls. Until someone's spoon hit a passing officer and the game was banned entirely. Now, most people have gone back to bone dice, real or imagined. You still keep yours in a pouch at your side. One of them is shaped more like a pebble than a cube. You roll it anyway. You call out the number. Sometimes you win. Sometimes you don't. But for a few minutes, you feel like chance is still a thing that lives on the wall, even if it only visits for short rounds and leaves when the wind turns bitter. You first noticed it after evening rounds, just as the sky was turning that sullen shade of blue that means the cold will come quick and stay longer than invited. It was a message. Scratched faintly into the lower left corner of the parapet, in a space that had been bare the day before. Not fresh, not like someone had just done it, but new to your eyes. The words were simple, still watching, still here. It wasn't signed, not unusual. Most of the graffiti wasn't. But this one felt different. Not a joke, not a sketch. No goats, no stew complaints, no taily marks of endless days. Just a statement. Unclear whether it was meant to comfort or warn. You ran your hand over the scratch. It was cold. Old, maybe, but you couldn't remember it being there yesterday, and the wall doesn't change that quickly. Usually. You said nothing. Not at first. What would you say? That the wall was writing back. That some silent sentry was scratching thoughts into stone under cover of darkness. That didn't sit well with your boots on solid ground. But the next morning there was another. Lower, behind a storage crate. It matters more than you think. Now it was unsettling. Expectation told you the wall was stone, inert, a place for guards, not whispers. Reality began to hint otherwise. You asked around. Casually, no one admitted to writing it. A few shrugged. One soldier laughed and said maybe the stones were finally trying to resign. Another said it might be the ghost of Hedrick, the one who left without leaving, writing down what he forgot to say out loud. You laughed with them. You didn't mean it. More messages came. Always vague. Always in places just barely out of view. Stay sharp. They remember. Once, don't go below the west stairs. You did, of course. Nothing happened. Just a damp smell and a crate of turnips someone had forgotten about. But the message was still there when you came back up. You checked. It hadn't moved. You started keeping a journal. Just notes. Where and when the words appeared. Their exact phrasing. You tried to detect a pattern. There wasn't one. Not really. But you started looking at the wall differently. Not just as stone, but as something that had seen too much. Heard too many footsteps. Soaked up too many secrets. You imagined it whispering at night, shifting mortar to spell what no tongue could risk saying aloud. One evening, you found a message that simply said, "You're not alone in this," and for a moment, you felt something close to gratitude. Even if it was a prank, even if it was nothing, it was something. On the wall, where messages come and go like breath in frost, you began to hope the stone might keep talking, because silence, you've learned, is not always the scariest thing. Sometimes it's the absence of anyone willing to write at all. There's a wall behind the latrine that no one uses for official announcements. It's not visible from the yard, not close enough to the watch line to matter, and not clean enough for birds to bother with, which makes it perfect for honesty. That's where the messages about the commander started to appear, scrawled in soot, scratched with belt buckles, or etched lightly with the end of a spoon. Not speeches, not threats, just thoughts, observations, sarcastic reviews of leadership etched one sentence at a time. You remember the first one you saw. It simply said, "His cloak eats better than we do." You laughed harder than you had in weeks. It was true. The commander's cloak, soft, heavy, suspiciously well oiled, had the aura of a thing fed twice a day and tucked in at night. Everyone noticed. No one said anything. Not officially, but the wall behind the latrine didn't require official. Another read, "He's made of pillows and orders." Below it, and smud tea. Someone else had drawn what looked like a teacup with legs, marching away from duty. Under that, "Warm biscuits don't win wars." You're not sure what that one was responding to, but it felt important. Expectation tells you a commander inspires awe, leads from the front, eats last. Reality often wears a fur-lined collar and assigns night watch from behind a sealed door, and so the soldiers write. When they think no one's looking, they leave small pieces of their resentment tucked into the cracks of stone like prayers with teeth. Some of the writing's old. You can tell by the fading, the way the stone has swallowed parts of words like a mouth chewing gossip. One says, "Still warm in there," dated perhaps 3 winters ago. Another simply says, "We see you." Not in a threatening way, more like a reminder that even from below, behind, outside, people are paying attention. You've never added your own message. Not yet. You've thought about it. You've rehearsed lines in your head, something clever, maybe, something that says everything without saying too much. But nothing feels quite right. Besides, the wall's already said it. In pieces. In fragments. Together, the insults, jokes, and bitter one-liners form something close to poetry, the kind that's muttered, not sung. The kind that lets you breathe without permission. Sometimes you wonder if the commander's ever seen the wall, if he's ever walked past it, late at night, and stopped just long enough to read the truth. Maybe he has. Maybe he even smiled. Or maybe he sent someone to scrub it clean, and it reappeared by morning, like moss with opinions. Because on this wall, truth finds its way out, even if it's dressed in soot and scratched behind a latrine. You first notice them while scrubbing your boots or trying to. Scrubbing, in this case, meant attacking frozen mud with a rag that had seen more winters than it should have survived. You sat in the narrow alley between barracks, where the wind doesn't scream but instead mumbles disappointments under its breath. That's when you looked up and saw them. Faces, carved into the outer wall. Faint, weather-worn. human. Just above the frost line where liking starts and memory ends. At least a dozen. None of them smiled. They weren't large, not theatrical. The kind of faces someone might make when trying to stay unnoticed or trying too hard not to forget. Cheekbones, brows, faint impressions of eyes that looked like they'd watched something they couldn't tell you about. Each face distinct. Each one silent. You asked around. Slowly, cautiously, casual, like it didn't matter. But everyone gave the same answer. What faces? You thought maybe they were a prank. A long-forgotten joke by someone with too much time and a sharp spoon. But they didn't feel like jokes. They weren't exaggerated or cartoonish. They didn't mock. They simply existed. Half faded. Slightly crooked. Some worn down by water lines, as if even the rain tried to erase them and gave up halfway through. One face in particular stayed with you, a narrow chin, a line for a scar, lips drawn together like someone halfway through thinking. You swore it looked familiar, like someone who used to sleep 3 bunks over, or someone who vanished last year during that sudden fog, or maybe someone you've never met, but would have liked to. Expectation teaches you that a soldier leaves behind stories, honors, records. Reality leaves behind carvings that no one admits to making, and that everyone walks past a little too quickly. You return the next night with a candle stub. You held it near the stone. Not too close wax is a rare luxury, and you'd rather not spend it on faces you can't explain. But the flickering light made them move. Not actually you're sure of that, but the shadows shifted across their features like expressions trying to return. As if, for one moment, the wall wasn't just holding stone, but memory, unofficial, unclaimed. You started checking them more often. Not every day, but when you passed by, when the mist was just thin enough, or your thoughts just heavy enough. Sometimes you count them. 12. Sometimes 13. Once 11. You never find out why. You've thought about carving a face yourself. A small one. Not detailed. Just enough. But you're afraid if you do, it'll vanish. Or worse, you'll come back and see it already there, waiting, slightly older than you remember. Because here, on the wall, the faces aren't there to be named. They're there to remind you that being forgotten doesn't always mean being gone. It started with a square. Scratched into the surface of the table near the south tower, the one with the wobble, and the nail that always catches your sleeve if you lean wrong. Just a square. Roughly drawn, about the size of your palm, with little notches on each side. You assumed it was a doodle. Boredom's fingerprint. But the next week it grew. Another square appeared beside it, then 2 more. A line. A curve. A faint spiral. And just like that, the table had become a game board. No one said anything. It wasn't formal. There were no pieces. No rules. But people started gathering around it. A soldier would sit, pick up a stone, and place it carefully on one of the carved shapes. Another would move it elsewhere. Then someone else would turn the stone sideways, which made no sense since it was flat. But there was a rhythm, a pattern. They argued, of course, but softly. Always softly. You asked what they were playing. No one could tell you, or wouldn't. The name changed depending on who you asked. It's called Spiral Court. We call it Wall Eyes. It's just something to do before stew. That last one might have been the most honest. And yet the moves mattered. You could feel it. Like how people paused before touching the stone, as if waiting for invisible permission. Expectation says games come with instructions, winners, losers. Reality hands you a circle of tired people and a piece of slate pretending to be order. At some point, the board began to spread. Little squares etched onto nearby stones. A shape drawn into the wall with charcoal. A pattern of dots under a bunk. All recognizably part of the same design. As if the game had started to seep into the barracks, absorbing boredom and giving it form. People started referring to things in strange ways. He's 3 from the center. That's a backward fork move. You tried to understand, truly, but it was like trying to learn grammar from a dream someone only half remembers. One night, the table was cleaned. Not just wiped, scrubbed. The carvings were gone. The board erased. You asked who did it. Everyone shrugged. The commander said nothing. The next day, someone redrew the square. Not all of it. Just enough to begin again. You never saw anyone carve the whole thing. It simply returned, slowly, like frost across glass, persistent and mostly silent. You started playing, eventually. You never won. You're not even sure if winning is possible, but you kept playing. Because on the wall, sometimes games aren't about victory. They're about creating something that gives your hands a task, your mind a loop, and your day the illusion that it isn't the same as yesterday, or the day before, or the week before. No one claims to have finished the game, but everyone plays it like finishing would be a mistake. It was pinned to the inside of the supply shed door, curled at the corners, soft with age and damp air. You didn't notice it at first, too busy looking for kindling that hadn't turned to sponge. But once you saw the lines, the carefully drawn edges, you stopped. A map, obviously. Ink faded but still legible. Long black lines, short tick marks, the strange shorthand of someone trying to impose order on a place that resists it. But there was only the wall. Nothing else. No forest. No villages. No trade routes or enemy markers. No names of hills or rivers or valleys. Just a long stone ribbon, snaking from one side of the parchment to the other, broken by towers and gates, annotated with small letters and odd dots, each one placed with intent. A closed system. A world with a beginning, a middle, and no clear end. At first, you assumed it was unfinished. Maybe someone forgot to add the rest. Maybe the rain got there first, but then you noticed the signature in the bottom corner. Tiny, precise, dutifully recorded. Final version. That's what it said. You showed it to two other soldiers. One squinted, nodded, and said, "Looks right to me." The other just stared and muttered, "Makes sense." What else is there? Expectation tells you that maps are meant to help you leave. They show roads, routes, alternate paths. Reality on the wall shows you a diagram of confinement. You returned later that night, when the shed was empty, to study it again. The ink looked darker in torchlight, more committed. You traced a path along the wall shape, following each tower with your finger. You found your own post, marked with a dot and a small triangle. You half expected your name to be there, written in miniature, trapped like a fly behind glass. The more you stared, the more you realized there was no off-ramp, no passage beyond. Even the gates led only inward, connecting to other parts of the wall. The design wasn't defensive. It was recursive, self-consuming. A fortress with no escape, not because it was secure, but because it didn't recognize anything outside itself. You asked the quartermaster who drew it. He shrugged, said it came with the last bundle of paperwork from Central. He didn't question it, said the detail was useful, said it helped keep track of who was where. He never noticed the absence of the world beyond, or pretended not to. You thought about drawing your own, adding trees, a river, maybe a road that leads somewhere quiet, but you didn't. Not because you lacked the skill, but because you were afraid you'd get it wrong, and the wrongness would make it real. So you left the map untouched. Let it hang there. Let it say what it said. Because maybe on the wall, the only map that matters is the one that admits nothing else exists. They called it the Lucky Tower, though no one could say why with any certainty. The name wasn't official. It never made it onto duty rosters or supply records. But everyone used it. The tower just west of the grain shed, slightly crooked, leaning as if eavesdropping on its own shadow. You wouldn't think anything of it until you dropped dice inside. They always landed on 6. Bone dice, bread dice, pebbles with charcoal dots. It didn't matter. Roll them near the east-facing corner of the tower floor, and they'd clatter once, maybe twice, and settle on 6. Not every time, but enough to notice. Enough to become legend. At first it was amusing. Soldiers sneaking in between shifts to test their luck. Some said it was the slope of the floor. Others whispered about buried metal beneath the stone, though no one had the courage or spade to find out. One person blamed Brutus, said geese were drawn to places where probability went strange. He was ignored, But the theory wasn't entirely dismissed. You tried it yourself. One night, when the mist had rolled in thick and the commander's voice was a rumor somewhere far away, you stepped into the tower, alone. Dice in hand, you knelt by the corner, whispered something that wasn't quite a hope, and let them fall. 6 and 6. Expectation says luck is fickle, unreliable, a flirt. Reality, for a time, said luck had a preferred location and favoured hands. People began using the tower for wagers, quiet ones. Not for stew rations, no one bets what they can't afford to lose, but for things like stories, small dares, blanket privileges. And for a while, it became a kind of ritual. A reason to visit the tower beyond patrols and pigeons. A brief nod to something mysterious, possibly magical, probably nonsense. But the results were there. Then one morning, the dice rolled a 2. Everyone heard about it. Word travelled faster than orders. The soldier who rolled it swore he hadn't cheated, hadn't changed the angle, hadn't even blinked. He rolled again. Another 2. A 4. A 1. Panic rippled gently through the barracks, not shouted, but whispered like a prayer gone sour. Expectation said the luck would fade someday. You just didn't expect to feel the shift. Reality made sure you did. After that, people stopped going to the tower. Not out of fear, just discomfort. Like realizing the charm you wore had never actually worked, or the gods you whispered to weren't picking up anymore. You passed it sometimes on your route, and every time. You looked at the stone near the east corner, still slightly worn, still vaguely shiny, still pretending it had no memory of being special. You keep your dice now, roll them in your hand, but never drop them there again. Because on the wall, when something impossible stops happening, it somehow feels worse than if it had never happened at all. They were carved low on the wall beneath the West Tower stairs, so low you wouldn't notice unless you dropped something, which is exactly how you found them, chasing a spoon that had escaped your pocket and committed to a slow, clinking descent down the steps like it had somewhere better to be. You bent to retrieve it and froze. Marks, dozens, maybe hundreds, scratched deep and clustered in uneven rows. Not the usual clean slashes, not the sort of marks soldiers make to count weeks, rotations, or stew nights. These were older, worn, weathered at the edges, and they didn't match any pattern you knew. Some were paired in sets of 5. Others came in rows of 7. One section looked like a spiral. Another had what might have been initials or just someone's attempt at carving a thought that turned into nonsense halfway through. You crouched there for a while, spoon in hand, staring at the stone like it might blink. You called over a friend. They looked, blinked, shrugged. Old taily marks. Probably a bored guard. We've all been there. Then they walked off, unconcerned, as if they hadn't just stepped past a secret. You tried to agree. You really did. But something about them bothered you. Expectation said counting is simple, straightforward, linear. Reality gave you chaos, scratched into rock by someone who clearly wanted to remember, but not in any language you understood. You came back the next day with charcoal and parchment, tried to copy the marks. It took hours. Your knees went numb, but when you stood and looked at the copy, it still made no sense. Not as a count, not as a map, not as a code, unless the code was meant to confuse. Someone suggested it was just a nervous habit, that maybe whoever carved it didn't even realize what they were doing. Another claimed it was a game, some long-lost version of dice notation. Someone else, less helpfully, said the marks were made by ghosts with obsessive tendencies and poor penmanship. No one could explain the spiral section. You stared at it more than you should have. It wasn't decorative. It was too rough for that. It tightened inward, tighter and tighter, until the lines were so close they blurred together into a smudged crater of effort. The center no one could read. You haven't told the commander. You won't. Whatever the marks are, they weren't meant for records. They weren't meant for orders. They were for someone, or from someone. Or maybe, in the way only the wall seems to understand, they were a way to mark time that doesn't care about calendars. Now, Whenever you descend those stairs, you slow down near that patch of wall, just in case a new mark has appeared. Because sometimes the wall doesn't measure days, it measures who remembers them. You spotted it by accident. A child's drawing, or something trying very hard to look like one. Crude lines scrawled in white chalk on the stone. Just beside the outer gate, a lopsided sun with stubby rays, 2 stick figures holding what might have been hands, and a house so tilted it would collapse under a sneeze. You assumed it had been done recently, maybe as a joke or a dare. Soldiers get bored. Chalk is cheap. The wall is always available. Then the storm came. Not just rain, the kind of weather that stripped shingles from roofs and dignity from commanders. Wind that howled like it remembered every insult ever hurled into the void. When it ended, you went out to check the gate, expecting the usual aftermath. Mud where there shouldn't be mud, barrels where there shouldn't be barrels, and Brutus in a place no one could explain. Instead, you saw the chalk drawing still there. Perfect. Not faded. Not smudged. Not even damp. Expectation told you chalk should wash away. Reality showed you a smiling stick sun, cheerful and dry in the aftermath of chaos. You asked the gatekeeper. He shrugged. Said he'd seen it a few times. Said it disappears sometimes, but it always comes back. Always in the same place. Always the same drawing. Could be some kid sneaks in, he said. Could be ghosts. Then he whistled and went back to inspecting hinges like that was a normal thing to say. You kept watching. The next time it rained, you checked again. The chalk was gone. Clean stone. Nothing unusual. And then, 2 mornings later, it was back. Same sun. Same stick figures. Same off-balance house, like it had tried very hard to believe in architecture, but gave up halfway through. No one took credit. No one was caught drawing. The drawing wasn't on the schedule. Not in reports. Not in anyone's duty. It just appeared. Vanished. Returned. Over and over, as predictable as stew and yet less comforting. Some soldiers started nodding to it on their way past. Not talking. Just a glance. A flicker of something soft. You did it too, eventually. Because even if it was nonsense, it was consistent nonsense. And on the wall, that was a rare kind of treasure. One night, during a thunderstorm that shook the barracks, you dreamed of the drawing. Only it was bigger. The sun moved. The stick figures waved. The house stood straight. You woke up before it fell. You've never tried to remove it. You don't touch it. No one does. It's not sacred, exactly. Just known. And sometimes that's enough. Because on this wall, where nothing stays for long, not people, not hope, not even boots that fit a piece of chalk that refuses to vanish, starts to feel like something close to faith. It was a fine door. That's what struck you first. In a place where wood warped, hinges squealed like offended pigs, and most frames seemed built by someone guessing what a rectangle should look like, this door was. Well, smug. Smooth, oiled, perfectly fitted. No rattling. No swelling in the rain. And when it closed, it didn't slam or creak. It just clicked, politely, firmly, like it knew it belonged to someone important. It led to the commander's room. Not his quarters that would imply something shared, something humble. No, this was a room. Heated. Sealed. Lined, probably, with the sort of cushions no one else was allowed to even describe out loud. You passed by it often, sometimes while dragging crates, sometimes while pretending to look for supplies you didn't need. The door never opened. It was always closed. The same way statues are always still. No one admitted to having seen inside. Not really. One soldier claimed he caught a glimpse when the commander entered, once a flash of something red. Another swore there was a golden cup on a small table, untouched by dust or doubt. You tried not to care. You told yourself it didn't matter. But the more you passed it, the more the silence behind it felt deliberate. Expectation says command comes with sacrifice. That the one in charge bears the cold, the hunger, the boredom, right beside the men. Reality hands you a quiet door, warm drafts seeping from beneath it, and the faint scent of cloves and roasted chestnuts, when the rest of the barracks smells like damp socks and boiled turnip tragedy. There were rumors of a fire inside, not the angry kind, but the comforting kind. A little hearth, tended hourly. The kind of warmth that makes your bones jealous. Supposedly, the commander drank tea. Real tea, not bark boiled in snow water and called optimism. The real stuff, dark, rich, fragrant. He had a tray for it. Someone once saw the tray. It had handles. You never knocked. No one did. There was no point. Requests were left in a box, taken once a day by a hand that emerged briefly pale, gloved, uninterested. Orders came back the same way. The door stayed shut. Once, during a storm that collapsed the east gate, you thought the door might open. Just once, the wind howled, the roof shook. Everyone scrambled, but not that door. It stayed still, unbothered, as if the weather had been told not to disturb it. Eventually, you stopped waiting. You started walking past it faster. You stopped wondering, or you told yourself you did. But even now, when your shift brings you near, you glance at it. Just once. To check. Because on the wall, you come to accept a lot of things. Hunger. Cold. Time that folds. But a door that stays closed forever, that never stops whispering that someone inside has chosen not to see. That's a different kind of quiet. They arrived mid-morning, in a cart that looked entirely out of place. Polished wheels. Clean wood. No wobble. No rot. Pulled by a mule that had clearly never suffered the indignity of cold oats or sarcastic commands. The driver wore gloves, actual gloves, and didn't smell like disappointment. He whistled. That alone put everyone on edge. The cart stopped by the officers' quarters. No announcement. No order. Just the soft creak of a brake and the distinct sound of things not meant for soldiers being gently handled. You watched from the yard, squinting into the sunlight, trying to piece together what you were seeing. Cushions. Not sacks. Not folded blankets. Not bundles of questionable hay. Cushions. Real ones. Velvet, probably. At least 2 were embroidered. One had tassels. You could see the tassels bounce when it was lifted, which was insulting somehow. The colours were deep and rich, dyed in hues that made your tunic look like something a scarecrow gave up on. You counted 7. Maybe more. They were carried inside through the commander's door, the one that never opens, never creaks, never gives away what it holds, by 2 porters who did not speak and refused stew when offered. That told you everything you needed to know. Expectation told you supplies were for the garrison. Shared. Distributed. Reality said otherwise. The cushions vanished. No one saw them again. Not even a stray thread or an indent in the wrong place. You checked. Of course you checked. You pretended to sweep near the commander's steps. You even invented a reason to deliver a message. But nothing. A few of the older soldiers laughed it off. Maybe he's building a fort. Maybe the goose gets a throne now. Someone muttered something about ritual comfort seating, which you sincerely hoped was a joke. You kept thinking about them, not because you needed a cushion, though your spine strongly disagreed, but because they arrived like hope disguised as upholstery. For a moment, the cart had looked like it might bring relief. Warmth. Softness. Something padded, maybe even shared. But it hadn't. And so you returned to your bunk, to your folded cloak, serving as a pillow, and your blanket with a hole that lets just enough cold through to remind you where you are. You lay there, thinking of red velvet, tassels, and the brief bounce of something that had never been meant for you. You haven't seen the cart since. Maybe it only visits walls where someone has enough rank to pretend cold isn't real. Or maybe it dissolved the moment its contents were absorbed into whatever reality exists behind that silent, smug door. Either way, you stopped waiting for it. Because on the wall, you learned quickly, if something looks soft, it probably belongs to someone who never has to earn it. Fire on the wall was a luxury. You learned that fast. Wood was scarce. Twigs were argued over like treasure. A splinter big enough to burn longer than a thought could start fights that ended with someone assigned to stew-stirring duty for a week. And that was worse than latrine patrol. But the commander's fire. That fire never went out. You saw the smoke first. Thin, clean, rising from the little chimney that only served one room. It curled into the sky in a smug little ribbon, not frantic, not struggling, just gently existing, as if to remind the rest of the wall that comfort was possible. Just not for you. The rest of the barracks burned what they could find: soggy branches, old crates, a broken broom once sacrificed in desperation. You learned to make heat out of friction and complaint. Some soldiers even whispered to their fingers, as if trying to talk them into staying warm out of loyalty, but the commander's hearth never flickered. Not once. Expectation said all warmth was rationed, shared, earned. Reality laughed and tossed another invisible log onto a fire you never got to see. There were nights when the temperature dropped so low your breath froze mid-air and hovered, judging you. You'd shiver under 2 cloaks, a blanket, and a firm belief that eventually the sun would show mercy. And still, the smoke rose steady, unbothered. The fire was always fed. No one knew how. The supply list never included fuel. You checked. Twice. The quartermaster swore no firewood had been delivered. You even watched the carts, counted the crates. Nothing that could have kept a single fire going for more than a day. Let alone weeks. Let alone forever. Rumours filled the gap. One claimed the commander had a magic log, one of those endless, self-burning types you hear about in fairy stories told by cold liars. Another said he was secretly in contact with someone from the capital, someone who mailed him fire wrapped in velvet. Someone else said the warmth wasn't from wood at all, just his pure, unbothered smugness radiating outward. You asked once, half as a joke, half as a plea, if the fire could be shared, just for one night. You were told it was a security risk, that it needed to be maintained uninterrupted for strategic morale continuity, whatever that meant. You went back to rubbing your hands together and pretending that hope burns hot enough. Eventually the fire became background, a symbol, a constant. You hated it. You respected it. You imagined it on cold nights, the way others imagine home. A hearth you could never sit beside, with logs you never saw, and warmth that never touched your skin. Because on the wall, some fires are for seeing, not for feeling. You smelled it first. Not strong, not like stew, which announces itself with the quiet panic of something trying to disguise rot, but gentle. Warm. Herbal. The kind of smell that makes you blink slowly and think of places with cushions and doors that close softly. It came from the commander's room, as always. The smell of tea. Not bark boiled in regret. Not leaf scraps rescued from supply crates. Real tea. Spiced, probably. Maybe imported. The kind poured from ceramic. Not ladled from a tin mug lined with rust. It drifted down the hallway every morning around the same time, as if on schedule, as if even the scent had discipline. You never saw the cup, only the steam, curling out of the commander's room like a reminder that warmth was being properly managed by someone qualified to enjoy it. The scent didn't linger. It was gone by midday, but for those few hours, it ruled the barracks like a memory none of you shared. Expectation teaches you that leadership earns its comforts through burden. Reality makes you breathe in someone else's tea, while your own water still tastes like metal and disappointment. One soldier claimed he once glimpsed the cup. A small thing, blue with gold trim. He described it like a lover, his voice reverent, his eyes suspiciously misty. Another swore the tea was jasmine, or cinnamon, or possibly something mythical that used to grow in a land with warmth and forgiveness. They couldn't agree on the flavour. They did agree on one thing: it was always hot. Every morning, the cup went in. No one saw who brought it. It simply arrived, sometimes in a box, sometimes in a cloth-wrapped carrier that looked far too clean to belong here. And every time, without fail, someone would say the same thing: still hot, must be nice. You tried to ignore it. You had your own drinks technically: boiled snow, brewed bark. Once, a concoction involving turnip skin and the ghost of a mint leaf. It warmed the hands if not the soul. But every sip came with the memory of that smell, the tea behind the door, the one that was never offered. One morning, you left a note outside the commander's door. It said, "If you ever have extra, we'd be grateful." It was signed by no one. It vanished within the hour. No reply. The next morning, the tea smelled stronger. You laughed a little, quietly, bitterly. then went back to stirring your bark water, pretending it didn't matter. But it did. Of course it did. Because on the wall, a hot cup of tea you'll never taste becomes more than a drink. It becomes a symbol of distance, of division, of comfort rationed out to those already warm. And still, every morning, you breathe in, just once, just to remember that softness exists even if it lives behind a door you don't get to open. It was late. The kind of late that made even Brutus go silent, his feathers puffed like a pillow that gave up on supporting anyone. You were meant to be asleep or pretending, which often amounts to the same thing, but your bunk was too cold, and the wind had found a new way to whistle through the boards above your head. So you wandered, quietly, carefully, feet soft on stone like an apology you didn't mean. That's when you heard it voices, not angry, not loud, calm, controlled, coming from behind the commander's door. You froze. Not because it was forbidden though it was, but because it was strange. The door never opened. The commander never spoke where others might hear. And yet here were voices. 2 at least. Maybe more. One deep and certain. One sharp, clipped, like someone used to being obeyed by maps. You couldn't make out every word. The walls were thick, and the commander, for all his softness, had chosen a room with discipline. But you heard phrases, not ready for contact, and holding pattern until the thaw. Someone said, containment, and another voice replied with something that sounded like numbers, though not in a way numbers should sound. You leaned closer. Just enough to catch more. They don't know. They're not supposed to. And that one hit you. Because even if it wasn't about you, it was about you. About all of you. The ones outside the door. The ones assigned to watch, to patrol, to wait in snow with nothing but wooden spears and vague promises. Expectation tells you the wall is for protection, for guarding against threats. Reality whispers that maybe it's to keep you in, not danger out. The voices went on. For minutes? An hour? You're not sure. Eventually they stopped. The sound of movement. Papers, maybe. Footsteps too soft to measure. Then the click of the door, that same soft, smug click, and silence again. Heavy, certain. Like it had never been broken. You stepped back. Not out of fear, but something worse, understanding. Or the start of it. You didn't tell anyone. Who would believe you? The wall eats rumors for breakfast. Besides, what could you even say? I heard something I wasn't supposed to, and now I feel like the frost is listening too. That's not the kind of thing you say out loud unless you want latrine duty and side eyes. But after that night, things felt different. Not openly. Not in ways you could name. But a few soldiers stood farther apart than before. Some looked up at the towers with a little more suspicion. Someone added a new message to the graffiti wall. We're not supposed to know. So let's not. You didn't write that. But you understood it. Because on the wall, what you're not told is sometimes louder than anything you'll ever hear. You didn't notice it at first. No one did. That was the point. The wall's routines are built like the bones of an old building, creaky, uncomfortable, but always in the same place. First horn, morning patrol, soup, drills, more soup, more patrol. Then shift changes, weapon checks, bad jokes, and the long stretch of night broken only by wind and sighs. The rhythm is mindless, boring, dependable. Until it isn't. It started small. You arrived for your shift, spear in hand, only to find someone already standing there. They blinked at you, confused, like you were the one out of place. You both checked the duty roster. It still said your name. So you waited. The next day, the same thing, different person. Then one morning, your name wasn't on the board at all. Expectation says orders are given clearly. Reality says sometimes the paper forgets who you are. At first, you assumed it was a mistake. A smudge. A bit of soot where your name used to be. You asked the quartermaster. He shrugged. Said the new schedule came from the commander. Said you were probably reassigned. You asked where. He shrugged again. Then he offered you an extra spoon. You took it. You didn't ask again. Over the next week, things got weirder. The bell rang early one day, then late the next. Meal times drifted like clouds. Patrol rotations overlapped or left entire sections unmanned. No one admitted anything had changed, but everyone moved with just a little more uncertainty, like dancers who'd rehearsed a routine and now had to guess the next step based on the twitch of someone else's eyebrow. You saw a soldier eating breakfast in the middle of what should have been weapons drill. He looked up, mouth full of bread, and said, "I don't know anymore. Maybe this is drill now." You nodded. You didn't know either. Someone posted their own schedule on the wall, scribbled in charcoal, titled, "The Real Plan, Maybe." It included guest patrol and optional TNV. It was removed by morning. Expectation teaches you that discipline is about clarity. Reality is more about confusion with posture. After a while, people stopped checking the official board. They just followed each other. If 3 soldiers stood near the north wall long enough, a 4th would join. If enough boots clattered toward the mess hall, others followed, bowls in hand, even if nothing was being served. You started carrying your gear at all times just in case. Sword, cloak, spoon, that one dry sock you swore brought luck. You weren't sure when you'd be needed, or if you were already being used in ways you didn't understand. Because on the wall, sometimes the schedule changes not to improve anything, but just to see who notices. And now you do. You saw it arrive. A courier on a pale horse, pale himself, with a face like someone trying not to remember the last 3 winters. He rode straight to the gate, handed over a sealed envelope, turned around, and left before Brutus could even decide whether to honk or bite. No words. No pleasantries. Just a letter. It was handed to the officer on duty, who stared at the wax seal like it might open itself. Red wax. A strange mark pressed into it, something like a bird or a broken crown, or maybe just a smudge with opinions. The officer didn't open it, just carried it, both hands, like a delicate package of bad news, up to the commander's door. You watched from the yard. Everyone did. Not openly, no one wants to look too curious, but subtly. Spoon paused mid-stir. Broom stopped mid-sweep. Conversations slowed like snow beginning to fall. The door opened. Just a sliver. A hand reached out. The letter disappeared. Expectation whispered change. Orders. Reassignment. Maybe even the end. You imagined the wall emptying, soldiers sent home. Your bunk traded for a bed that didn't insult your spine. You imagined warmth. You imagined nothing at all. Just not this. But nothing happened. The next day, the wall looked exactly the same. So did the commander's door. The fire still smoked. The tea still steeped. The schedule still shifted like a drunk guessing the time. The silence remained. Someone asked the officer what the letter said. He blinked. Didn't read it. Someone else said it came from Central Command. Another said it was a weather update. One of the cooks claimed it was an invitation, a royal banquet. Maybe. No one believed her, but it was a nice story. You started watching the commander more closely. Not directly, just in passing. Did he stand differently? Speak less? But no, he remained the same patch of stillness in a world made of cold wind and confusion. He said nothing. He always said nothing. Expectation says messages are meant to bring action. Reality reminds you that some letters are just rituals, symbols, quiet admissions, that no one really knows what to do, but writing it down makes it feel like someone might. A week later, another envelope arrived. Same seal. Same silence. Same vanishing hand. It disappeared too. And again, nothing changed. You think about writing your own letter sometimes. Not to the commander, just to someone, anyone. To say, we are still here, the wall hasn't fallen, but we are tired in ways we don't know how to explain. You never do. There's no wax. No seal. No certainty that anyone's still reading. So you just watch the door, watch the hand, and wait. Because on the wall, letters arrive like whispers pretending to be answers and vanish like they never expected to be believed. You check the board like you always did, more out of habit than hope. The names posted there were for assignments, rotations, duties you already knew by heart. You never expected to see anything new, certainly not anything with your name on it. And for months, maybe years, you didn't. Then one morning, There it was. Your name. In ink. Neat. Official. At first you didn't believe it. You looked twice. Thrice. You wiped your sleeve across the parchment, as if the frost had played a trick on you. But there it remained, unbothered by disbelief. A list of 6 names. Yours at the bottom. No instructions, just a heading. Internal reallocation. Commander's note. You waited for someone to say it was a mistake. A prank. A scribble added by someone with nice handwriting and too much time. But no one laughed. No one denied it. The others on the list had already packed their things, what little there was to pack. A blanket. A spoon. A bone die. You stared at them, and they nodded back like this was normal. Expectation says promotion comes with ceremony, or at least an explanation. Reality posts your name on a board and expects you to walk toward a door that rarely opens. You didn't pack, not really. You didn't have much to begin with. A bent fork. A journal with pages missing. That one sock you kept pretending was lucky. You carried it all in a pouch too thin to deserve the title bag. Then you waited. No one came to fetch you. No orders were spoken aloud. At sunset, the door opened. Just enough. No words came from inside. Just the brief smell of warmth cloves, ink, something faintly citrus. Someone gestured. You couldn't see their face. Just a sleeve. Clean, pressed, pale. You hesitated, not because you feared punishment, but because you feared change. You feared not knowing whether this meant you'd been trusted or selected, rewarded or removed, re-signed or forgotten in a more organized way. You stepped forward, because what else could you do? The door closed behind you without sound. Inside, everything was quiet. Not silent, not the harsh, unbreathing quiet of cold wind and tired bones, but the kind of quiet that comes with insulation. The floor was smooth. The air was still. The room smelled like things not meant to be described by people like you. You didn't see the commander. Not right away. Just a chair. A desk. A kettle not boiling, but waiting. And another list. This one longer. Names you recognized. Names you didn't. Your name again, now crossed out. Because on the wall, sometimes you're invisible until someone needs something. And then, just as suddenly, you disappear again. It wasn't large, the room, not grand or impressive. You'd imagine something different, a war chamber, maybe, or a study lined with ancient scrolls that smelled like wisdom and mildew. But this room, it was plain, quiet, built for something no one talked about. The walls were smooth stone, unusually clean, with a small table at the center and a chair that wasn't quite comfortable, but still better than anything in the barracks. It had a cushion, a real one, stuffed with something that had bounce. There was no window, just a single door behind you. It shut before you could turn around. Expectation told you someone would speak, give you orders, tell you why you were here. Reality let the room breathe in your silence and gave nothing back. You stood for a while, then sat. You waited. You examined the table. Not much on it, a slate, a quill, a bowl of something that might have once been fruit but now resembled sadness dressed in peel. A pitcher of water, beaded with condensation. You didn't drink. Not yet. Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. The room had no clocks. Just air and stillness and your own heartbeat, growing louder in your ears. You began to notice things. A hairline crack in the stone near the floor. The faint smell of citrus, the same one from the commander's quarters. A scraping sound, far away, like someone moving furniture in a house made of secrets. Eventually, a slip of paper was pushed under the door. It had your name on it. One line beneath. Remain where you are. Further instruction forthcoming. You read it 3 times. Then folded it. Then unfolded it again. You waited. The next slip came the following day. You think. It was hard to tell. The light didn't change. Meals arrived through a sliding tray. Silent, clean, no footsteps ever accompanied them. Just warm food that tasted like memory, something you might have had before your first winter. Something that didn't belong here. You stopped asking questions aloud. There was no point. The walls weren't listening. Or maybe they were too much. Expectation says imprisonment feels like chains, like shouting in cold stone. Reality on the wall feels like quiet rooms with good chairs and food that makes you wonder who you were supposed to become instead. On the fourth day, if it was the fourth, you started talking to the crack in the stone. Not with words at first, just thoughts, then whispers, then soft questions. Nothing answered. Yet, but you remain. Because on the wall, being forgotten doesn't always mean being lost. Sometimes it means being preserved indefinitely, comfortably, quietly. And you begin to wonder, if the door opens again, will you even want to leave? You didn't hear it open. It just was. One moment the door was a wall, as it had always been unmoving, unhelpful, unkind. The next it stood slightly ajar. No sound. No knock. No footsteps. No note pushed beneath. Just open. You stared at it for a long time. Expectation rushed in that someone would appear. That an officer would bark your name, or the commander himself would appear, steaming tea in hand, ready to explain the grand purpose behind days of silence and fruit-shaped lies. But no one came. Reality sat quietly beside you, reminding you that no explanation was often the only explanation. You stood, slowly. Your legs worked, though stiff. Your back cracked with the quiet defiance of someone reintroducing themselves to gravity. You approached the door, half expecting it to close again, to snap shut, like a joke with poor timing. But it didn't. It waited. Beyond it was the same hallway. Stone, cold, familiar, but empty. You stepped out. You called a name not yours, just any. A test. The sound echoed down the corridor, bounced off walls that remembered better days, and returned to you with nothing new. You walked toward the light, not dramatic light, just a normal torch flickering the way it always does when no one is there to steady it. No one. Not in the corridor. Not in the yard. Not at the posts. It wasn't abandoned, not exactly. There were signs of people. A bowl left on a bench. A half-carved game board. A coat draped over a railing like its owner meant to return before nightfall. But no boots on stone. No voices. No Brutus. Expectation says emptiness announces itself with dread. Reality brings it in gently, with questions instead of screams. You wandered the yard, poked your head into runes, listened, waited. There were no bodies, no blood, just absence. As if everyone had been called to a meeting and forgot to invite you. As if the wall had turned inside out. In the mess hall, a spoon sat in soup gone cold. Steam still clung to the surface, not long gone, but leaving. A page of the schedule board had been torn down. No new orders had been posted. You looked up at the commander's door. It was open too. That was somehow worse. Inside, the room looked untouched. Chair straight. Fire out, but still warm. A single cup on the table, half full. Not abandoned, just paused. As if the owner had stepped out for a moment and would return once you'd left again. You didn't sit. Instead, you stepped back into the hallway, retraced your path to the door that first opened, and stared at it, waiting for it to explain. It didn't, because on the wall, doors don't speak. They just open. And sometimes, no one is on the other side. And so the wall fades behind you now slowly, softly as if stepping backward into mist. The cold doesn't bite so much anymore. The silence doesn't press as hard. The doors, the dice, the tea, the tower, all of it begins to blur like a dream you carried too long in your hands. You were there, though. You remember. You stayed through nights without fire and days without orders. You read the jokes scratched into stone, rolled imaginary dice, and watched a chimney that never ran out of smoke. You waited when no one called your name. You listened when no one spoke. And still, you remained. Thank you for keeping watch with us, for walking the length of a wall where everything stayed the same until it didn't. If you made it to the end, you're the kind of person this wall was built for. Quiet, resilient, listening for the things no one says. There's another story waiting just past the gate. Another set of boots to wear, but for now rest. Let the fire you imagined finally warm you. Let the weight in your shoulders ease. And now, as you lie there, you know the loop will wait once more for you.